the
We should have brought Legos.
yeah.
I also noticed that, when you've got these ideas in your head, you're a game designer, it's like, oh, I'm going to design this game and it's going to do this and this and this, and the player's going to have all these great opportunities. You notice really quickly when you're doing a paper prototype the difference between what's in your head versus what actually happens when the player is moving through your experience. And so you tend to catch the glitches, like something you initially thought in your head would be really fun and really cool. You see that for one reason or another, it didn't work the way you thought it was going to work because maybe the player didn't understand it, or maybe you didn't balance things correctly. And those are really important mistakes to catch before you go into programming, which goes back to what he says about budget and resources, because, man, it works a lot better to know going into the programming process that your mechanics can stand on their own.
Right. And I think not just what Heidi is talking about, finding the mistakes as you are thinking about them and thinking on paper, but also it's the connections of everything together. If you have your paper prototype, like let's say your maps laid out together, and you realize my level isn't fitting together. It's physically not fitting together. Now, back in the ancient days when I was making video games, we didn't have to worry about that because everything was being loaded in individually. But now you could make an entire structure, building, gameplay environment that lives in one file. And so if you do this first on paper, you understand the relationships of anything from the physical space to systems. Now, the other way to paper prototype is what I found was a really good trick, which was to cartoon out. Essentially, I storyboarded my gameplay, and I did it kind of in almost like a comic strip form. And if you look at my book, you'll see examples of this. But in it made it so clear. I was able to get it down to a point, and there's a little bit of bragging, but I was able to get it down to a point where I could show up to my programmer who was to make me maybe doing a boss fight, and I'd show up with like a sheath of maybe 5 to 10 sheets of paper, but with illustrations showing this is what happens when the boss does this is what happened when the player does this, these are the relationships of what happens in the world, is what the world looks like. I'd hand it to him, and I literally would come, now that's why I laughed at Brandii, because I literally did go away for like a couple of weeks, and I came back and played it, and I'm like, oh my God, you've already hit like 85% of this right on the nose. But this came from years and years of learning how to communicate this way. But I think that if you do things on paper, at least from the designer perspective, you can knock out about 75 to 80% of the problems that you would normally encounter if you just were like, I'm just going to jump in and do it.
Yeah, it's always different when you actually get to try it than what you thought it was like.
He touched on something else that's really very important to note when you're working with a variety of disciplines in a studio on a game, and that is that sometimes there's a translation problem between design and art and audio, and paper prototyping, I think, is one of the quickest avenues of normalizing that for everyone.
Right. Picture speaks 1,000 words,
Yeah,
right? Or it could be a map or a Google image that you pull up or something like that.
And a paper prototype speaks 200 game development document words.
Right, because now you can sit down and play it and everybody understands the systems very quickly. There's a bit of a translation issue that might happen where people are still wrapping their heads around the concept of, all right, I understand how we're doing this with dice or we're doing this with cards. What does that mean for gameplay? But remember, some of the earliest video games were translations of board games, Dungeons and Dragons, Diplomacy, Risk, things like that. A lot of our heritage from the video game industry comes from board gaming or role-playing games. And those were all paper games, and we're just translating those for this new medium called video games.
Yeah, and they pointed out the communication issue. There's no game designer joke. If you tell the artists you want a horse, you'll get a beautiful unicorn. If you tell the programmers you want a horse, you'll get a very efficient camel. When they come together, you're going to get an ugly thing with a horn and 2 lumps.
Now, there is a caveat in that you can't replicate the entire game experience, a video game experience, on a paper prototype.
Absolutely.
Not the user interface, maybe not even the dynamic element of participating in it. And a lab I run with my own students is I have them prototype a first-person shooter, which, you don't have the experience of running and shooting when you're working with paper materials. But what I have them do is create a level on graph paper, and we simulate the turning and shooting and moving with cards. And that each card, each action has a priority in terms of the speed in which you can do it. And you take cards, you determine ahead of time which actions you're going to perform, lay out those cards, and then do certain actions in certain orders. It doesn't allow you to get the real-time feel, but you can kind of simulate that in a turn-based way. That will teach you other things about the game. It will teach you a little bit about the level. It will teach you a little bit about the rules of your game in terms of damage and collecting health points to repair damage, and maybe a little bit about weapons if you have different types of weapons. So there are certain things that paper prototyping will teach you. There are certain things, though, it won't. So you have to decide that ahead of time.
Yeah, thank you. This was the next question I was going to ask. Let's talk about the drawbacks, what you can't do and what you can do to get around what you can't do in prototyping.
David just answered it.
The whole thing? You don't have anything to contribute.
Of course I do. Let's
Of course you do.
First.
Well, I think that when you're dealing in the world of a game that is a very story-heavy game, it definitely loses something when you're just the person running the playtest and you're reading the story on the cards, and you have to give them 3 cards and they have to pick which response they're going to lay down. That's not the same thing as having the NPC explain that you have to help her because somebody kidnapped her child. I mean, it's...
Maybe if you wear a different hat.
And anyone who knows me knows that I usually am wearing a humongous hat.
Gorgeous hat.
But yeah, it does like with story games in particular, it loses something. It loses the immersion and loses some of the fun.
Yeah, and I think that there are certain types of, like David inferred, that the speed is definitely something that is hard to communicate. This, like for example, a puzzle game. If you were to prototype something like Tetris, now there are games that exist that are versions of Tetris. I'm thinking of Blocus and games like that, but they're not the same experience. They're about the relationship of the tetrahedrons in relationship to each other on some sort of board, but they don't capture that speed aspect of it. Now, you could probably introduce a timer or have somebody go, okay, go, and and have some sort of moderator, I guess. But yeah, the thing about video games that's so powerful is the immediacy of it, and also the scope. I think that prototyping something like Grand Theft Auto is doable, but the time it would take to physically build that out as a paper prototype, I don't know, that's where I would kind of go, well, maybe it's not worth the effort, right? It'd be fun to do, but just to that level of detail, I think, is a little too much for paper prototyping.
Physics engines are hard for certain.
Yeah.
I used to teach with my students about doing prototypes for first-person shooters. I did an experiment where I took them out into the woods with a bunch of equipment and Nerf guns and said, "Here, prototype. This is your level." They had to block off areas, so it actually worked for some students.
Yeah.
So there's all sorts of things you can do, but these students that are here and non-students who are just awesome are going to make their own board games today. So let's give them a few tips. Talk about what are the more time-consuming things to prototype and create, because maybe they shouldn't be doing those today, or the harder ones.
Don't worry about art. If you're the very first pass of it should be to get to the heart of the gameplay as quickly as possible, and think about what I call the primary action, which is what is the main thing you want the player to be doing? So, for example, if you're making a card game that's about making, runs of cards or sets of cards, that should be the main thing you concentrate on. How do we very quickly get the player to want to start creating these sets of cards? Or if it's a game about lying, what can we do to get the players to lie to each other as quickly as possible? Because you want to start getting that that initial dynamic working together very quickly, because you're going to find out very quickly where it breaks. So, you guys have all heard the saying, fail fast. That's doubly true in paper prototyping. You want to fail as fast as possible, because then you can throw out everything that doesn't work, or the things that aren't guiding you towards what you want the player to do. Because remember, as game designers, we are designing an experience. It is about getting the players to do what we want you to do. The trick is to do it without the player feeling like you can feel our hand on you.
I've seen people get stuck on theming, which is kind of what you're talking about also, but when Elon Lee invented Exploding Kittens, it wasn't originally called.
It was like a
Exploding-
bomb. It was like a bomb squad. Yeah.
It was called Bomb Squad, and it was supposed to be a game about diffusing bombs. And they realized, well, this is really good gameplay, but we want to make it sillier. And so the Exploding Kittens angle was added later on by his friend from the Oatmeal. So he's very right about figure out what the goal of your game is. What goal is it that you want your player to meet? And what gameplay elements and mechanics do they need to utilize in order to get to that goal? And then you can add as much silliness as you want.
Yeah, and I know we're talking about paper prototyping for video games, but since it has very close ties to board gaming, changing a theme of a board game or a card game or dice game is a moderately common thing within the industry. So you might make the most wonderful game about space pirates, and all of a sudden the publisher that you've sold your game to might decide, you know what, let's make it about dirigibles and with steampunk or something like that, right? So they might change it moderately, or they might even change it completely and say, well, we don't want to do it about bombs, let's make it about gardening instead.
I kind of want to make a game about steampunk space pirates.
All right, well, let's talk after the meeting.
And it's okay to not worry about what other people have done. I mean, I also designed a game called Bomb Squad a long time ago. So
there are actually several bomb diffusing games out there.
How many first-person shooters shooting aliens have you seen? And many of them are successful.
At least 2.
You also have to remember that the whole point of prototyping is to get something playable as soon as possible. So as Scott and Heidi said, don't get bogged down in the art, even the details of the story, the rest of the theming. First, figure out what kind of experience are you trying to create. Fast-paced, slow-paced, challenging, casual. And then figure out the core mechanic, as you said. And then don't worry about every single rule. Just work out the basic procedures. How do your players set up the game? How do they progress during their turns from the start to the end? And what are the different ways to end the game? You can always add the details, all the different rules later on. Get your basic gameplay working first.
And let me double stress what David just said, which is knowing the win condition, the victory condition, getting that's when you play a game, that's usually the first thing the player wants to know. How do I win at this game, be it a board game or a video game? Because that gives them a mental target of what to shoot for. Okay, now I have to figure out, how do I use these components, these pieces in front of me to achieve that victory path? So letting them know that early is super important.
And if there's a loose condition, like if something happens, you're out, or if you're playing, betrayal at the house on the hill, and somebody kills you and you die, those need to be clear as well. Knowing how to win is important, but knowing if there is a definite fail state that they need to avoid or pay attention to, that helps.
Sometimes winning is just not losing for the whole game.
Exactly.
Games of attrition are also good.
Survive.
I always tell my students there's 3 things a game designer should always know at every time every point in their game. What is my player's goal? What does my player need to do to get to it? And how does my player know those things? Because if you don't know how they know it, they don't know it. All right, before we turn this all over to let them work on stuff, do you have any final tips or saying things that you want them to know about?
So even though we've said avoid theme, don't be afraid to let it inspire you. If you say, hey, I have a cool idea about monsters eating cookies, then you're like, all right, just start with that statement, and then you can start building your game for that. But don't worry about what the monster's name is, what color fur he has, what type of cookie. Is it oatmeal? Is it brownies? Whatever. You can use that creative inspiration, because game designers can come from at many different angles to coming up with a game idea, and one of them very much is the theme, and another one is the mechanism. So don't even though we're saying don't do theme, not do theme.
I would encourage people to remember that there are many different kinds of player motivations. There's a scholar named Nick Yee that many of you have probably heard of, that he has a survey online that you go and you take a survey, and it'll tell you what kind of player you are, what specific type of play motivates you. Well, you want to try to consider more than one type of gameplay, more than one player who will be playing your game, who's it going to appeal to, and there are more than one ways to play a game. You can play competitively, but you can also play cooperatively, and that can be a fun way to play too.
Yeah, another great resource for that is Richard Bartle's test. It's called the Bartle's test, and you can find that online as well.
Accept the fact that your game is going to suck at first. No one comes up with a fully formed game when they first think about it. And what you think is going to be great, once you play with playtesters, you're going to discover what's unclear, what's not fun, what's frustrating. So that's actually the whole point of prototyping and playtesting, is to test it out with other people and find out what they like and don't like. So you're inevitably going to make changes to it. When you do make your changes, make big changes. If you find some numbers are off, don't add a little, like 5% difference or 10% difference to figure out what's wrong. Double it or triple it. That will lead you to clues as to what you need to modify in your game, where it needs to be tweaked in order to make it much more fun.
Also throw in there, think about who your target player is. Because if you tell me that your game is made for everyone to play it, I'll go get my 18-month-old and see if he can play it very well. So really think about who your player is, because different players like different mechanics. Somebody's not going to like the lying mechanic if they really are uncomfortable with that. Somebody's not going to like first-person shooters if they're not good at Twitch. So think about your player.
And ultimately, when you get to the point where you're going to be play testing it with other people, don't be surprised if everybody doesn't like it, right? You can't make a game, just like Brandii said, you can't make a game for everybody, so don't expect it. Just try to aim it for the closest you can for the audience you want it to be for.
Any last-minute thoughts before we move on?
He mentioned cookies.
Sorry.
Now I need cookies.
We don't have cookies, I'm sorry. We might if somebody wants to put that in their game mechanic. Any thoughts?
What you said before about the fact that some things you may want to try are not going to appeal to everybody. Keep that in mind if you're thinking about mixing genres of games. This probably applies more to video games than board games. But when you mix genres, you run the risk of alienating somebody who doesn't like one of the two genres you mix. So a lot of people do that, just try to come up with something innovative. Be warned that it does limit your audience.
Right, or it might end up being a nasty surprise. I remember Brutal Legend. Everybody thought it was going to be this great action platformer, and in reality, it was a turn-based strategy game. And everybody kind of went, "What? Wait, where did this come from?" It kind of threw people for a loop. So yeah, absolutely. Set expectations early. Let people know what they're in for as soon as they enter it, and because that's going to get your audience is knowing what they're going to be playing.
Okay, so for this, you're going to have certain constraints. You're going to have the equipment that David has brought, and you have to use at least 2 things that he brought. You can use other things, including both the materials he's got, things like your chairs, your body, your voice, your social interactions. All those things are free for you to use. We're also going to have some verbs for you to pick from, and you're going to incorporate those into your game. So keep in mind, constraints can actually help you, and if you're really stuck and you can't think of anything else to do, think of a game you've played that's like that and start from there. It's better to start from cloning a game and then changing it to be your own than it is to just flounder and not know what to do.
The good borrow, the great steal.
All right.
Also, just so you know, after we get done with the prototyping and having fun with that, I brought along a few board game prototypes just so you can kind of see the progression of what something that is actually going to be published looks like. So that way it just gives you some visual targets to kind of go, okay, I kind of see where it starts and kind of where it's, what ended up with something that I was able to sell to somebody else.
Awesome. Thank you. And we are going to, at the end, share the games that we've made with everybody. And the ones that we like the best, apparently we've got some awesome swag for them as prizes.
I hope so.
Apparently we might have some awesome swag for you as prizes. All right, so what we'd like you to do is go ahead and get in groups of at least 4, no more than 6. But if you can't do more than 2, that's okay. But we prefer groups of 4.
And then we're going to meet we have rooms next door.